Right now on the Weather Network. Hey, guess what? We are not in storm watch. Hard to believe, isn't it? It seems like every single weekend there's another snowstorm. It may not be snowy, but it is cold across the country, including here in southern Ontario, and there is another storm on the way. The biggest storm across the country this week looks to be in British Columbia for Monday, but here across the GTA, we could be seeing our next storm by Thursday, and I'll talk about that coming up. First, let's take a quick look at this weekend. Notice not an awful lot going on, but by the time we reach tomorrow afternoon, there is this low pressure system skimming just to our south. It's not going to bring a lot of snow, but watch for flurries tomorrow afternoon and evening, and we may pick up a centimeter or two. Heavier amounts toward Kingston and Prince Edward County. In fact, there was a lot of snow yesterday. Let's have a listen to some of our stormline callers.
Oh, hi.
By the way, if you ever want to call our storm line, 1-800-463-WIND is the number. But let's talk about lake effect snow for a moment. That's what they were dealing with in around Picton and around Prince Edward County yesterday. I know it's not impacting us here in the GTA, but if you happen to be driving east along the 401 toward Kingston, you may run into it again today. Lake Ontario is not nearly frozen over. And so we have those winds being driven off of Lake Ontario, and that's how we get the lake effect snow. There is a watch in place issued by Environment Canada to potentially see that band of snow shift further north again, so they may run into more snow today. And that's just a heads up if you are doing any traveling to our east. Besides that, it's all about the cold. You follow the legend or the scale on the top of the screen. Purple is cold Arctic air, and we're socked into the cold air again for most of the week. Not that polar vortex kind of cold air, but we're certainly well below seasonal, especially when you factor in the winds. Today in Toronto, it's not going to feel much warmer than about -15 or -16. You can see the cold air continuing. Tuesday could be the coldest day of the week, only getting up to about -10, and then eventually by Thursday, that's when our temperatures moderate closer to the freezing mark. That's the way our weather story is working out here across southern Ontario. If you could stay with us, though, that would be great. And if you're missing Chris St. Clair like I am, I wish he was in the studio with me, but he's live from British Columbia. He's still joining the show. We're going to be checking in with Chris again coming up after your next local forecast. In this edition of Force of Nature Extended, we have an update to a story we told you about last weekend. If you remember this video, Chris St. Clair, Canada's favorite weatherman, he's going to be with us on the show, but he's going to be live from British Columbia. You don't want to miss it. Our Weekend Weather Watch begins now. So this was the drive into Toronto yesterday. If you're making your way into the city, around the city today or tomorrow, it's going to look fairly similar. A mix of sun and clouds, but it is going to be cold. And of course, our wind chill values are feeling even colder. Let's take a quick look at your long range forecast, because you're probably thinking it's the weekend. We're in storm watch. Oh, wait, we're not. It's going to be a pretty calm weekend besides the cold. Today, we're looking at calm conditions tomorrow, though, especially tomorrow evening. We have this low pressure system just skimming to our south. It could drop a centimeter or two here and there, which we'll talk about more coming up. But before I take a look at the rest of our long range forecast, I want to check in with Chris, because you're probably thinking, where's our good friend Chris? Well, he is live from British Columbia. All right, thanks, Chris. We miss you, but we'll be checking in with you throughout the program, so everyone can stick around for that. I mentioned a light dusting of snow across the GTA for tomorrow evening, for Monday, and then for Tuesday, and then for Wednesday. It's going to be pretty similar, mostly sunny skies, just cold and breezy, but we are watching this low pressure system across the prairies for Wednesday. Maybe for Thursday and Friday, that could be our next storm system as it makes its way toward the Great Lakes, but until the second half of the week, things are looking calm, but cold, and you're thinking, well, how cold is it? Okay, thanks for joining us as we take a look at highway conditions across the country. As far as snowfall is concerned this weekend, with strong winds coming off of the water in Newfoundland, we're looking at some sea effect snow. Nothing too heavy, but you could run into some snowy conditions out on the roads. Same thing in southern Ontario. Not bad today, except if you're around Kingston and Prince Edward County. Watch for some lake effect snow coming off of Lake Ontario. And most of southern Ontario for tomorrow evening could see a centimeter or two. Also for tomorrow night, there's snow on the way for southern British Columbia. We'll talk about that coming up. Now on the Weather Network, guess what? We are not in storm watch. We're not talking about a huge Saturday snowstorm here in southern Ontario, like we seem to be every weekend, but it is cold across the country, especially here in southern Ontario, and there is another snowstorm in the long-range forecast. There's a bigger storm for Monday in British Columbia. If you have family, friends, kids living in Vancouver, they could actually see some snow tomorrow night. As far as our next storm here across the GTA, maybe Thursday into Friday, so that's the next system we're watching. But for now, it's just cold. And on a map like this, just to remind you, we have the legend on the top there. That purple represents cold Arctic air. So we are socked into that cold Arctic air yet again. It's not the polar vortex kind of cold air, not as cold as we have been dealing with, but we're certainly still below seasonal. And that trend, in fact, lasts right through the week once again. If you're wondering how cold it's going to be today, -9 is a daytime high in Toronto. Will feel like -16 when you factor in the wind. So bundle up if you're taking the kids out. We'll take a closer look at our forecast in just a moment, but my good friend Chris St. Clair is live in BC. Let's check in with Chris. We look forward to it. Thanks a lot, Chris. Chris was mentioning a mix of sun and clouds in southern BC. Same thing here in southern Ontario. High pressure is in place. You will see sunshine today. However, tomorrow, and more so the afternoon through the evening, there's that low pressure system, a very fast mover, just skimming to our south. What does that mean for us? It means some flurries tomorrow afternoon and evening, maybe a centimeter or two, heavier amounts if you go toward Kingston, Prince Edward County. So if you're driving east, you could run into some snow squalls later today. But besides that, it's looking like a fairly calm long-range forecast until Thursday, Friday. As I mentioned, that's our next chance at a storm. We'll be keeping a close eye on that system coming in from the prairies. And Chris, do you miss him? I miss him. I wish he was in the studio with me, but he's live out in BC like he has been all week. We'll check back in with Chris coming up next after your local forecast. Cold across. Go grab your cup of Folgers coffee and join us as we take a look at our forecast across the country. And I'll tell you, the big theme from coast to coast is once again cold. Even in British Columbia, Vancouver today will not be getting much warmer than about 1 degree. And there's even some snow in the forecast for Sunday night, which we'll talk all about coming up. Coldest air across the country this weekend will be across the prairies. Saskatoon today only getting up to -22 and below seasonal in southern Ontario. Hamilton a high of -9. Further east and around Kingston and around Picton, Lake Ontario has the least amount of ice coverage. You can see at 32%. So as long as we don't have our lakes frozen over, we could still have lake effect snow. And that's the story again today. If you're leaving Toronto and heading east toward Kingston, you may run into a lake effect snow band coming off of Lake Ontario. And that's an interesting story if you do have any travel plans. But besides that, we're looking at a pretty great day across southern Ontario. There's no real storm to speak of, unlike every other weekend this winter. Temperatures are the big story, though. It's cold and feeling a lot colder when you factor in the wind. So coming up in a moment, we'll take a look at your temperatures and the potential for snow tomorrow evening. You won't want to miss that. But first, it is the weekend, and a lot of people tune into the Weather Network every weekend to see our good friend, Chris St. Clair. So let's check in with Chris because he is live in Vancouver.
Emily?
Okay, but you have to come back. I don't want to hear any of this. I'm staying in Vancouver talk. Chris will eventually be back. Don't worry. Don't worry. He has a trip to Florida planned. He won't want to miss that. But again, enjoy the day today. Tomorrow is an interesting story because there's this low pressure system in the U.S. It's going to stay to our south, but it's going to skim southwestern Ontario, which means tomorrow afternoon and evening, we are definitely going to see some flurries. Whether we see a centimeter or two, it's not going to be much. And then through the long range forecast, it's quiet until maybe Thursday night into Friday. That's our next chance at seeing a storm. Besides that, it's all about the temperatures. And it is going to be cold today. Watch, yeah, breathe a sigh of relief. There's no major snowstorm across the eastern half of the country, but it is cold from coast to coast. We'll tell you who's seeing what in terms of temperatures, and then there is a big storm on the way. In British Columbia, it's the big pattern changer. Beginning tomorrow night, there is snow in the forecast. And we'll talk all about snow and storms and cold temperatures coming up. I want to start with cold, though, because it's impacting all of us. From Newfoundland to British Columbia, you see that purple color. It represents the cold Arctic air. And for most of us, that lingers all week long into next weekend, except in BC, when we do start to see those temperatures warming up. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. First, though, Kim McDonald takes us around the world in 80 seconds. Okay, thanks to Kim for that. Let's go back to the big pattern change, though, across the country, beginning in British Columbia. Starting tomorrow evening, it's cold enough for snow. Vancouver toward Vancouver Island. We could be seeing 2 to 5 centimeters of snow. A light dusting in Metro Vancouver is likely. And then that really changes the pattern, as Chris was mentioning earlier, because temperatures will actually start to warm up. We have what we call a pineapple express that originates in around Hawaii. It brings a lot of moisture and warmer air. So eventually on Monday, we'll go from snow to maybe freezing rain to eventually rain. It's going to be very messy on Monday. And coming up, we'll talk about the light dusting of snow, maybe a centimeter or 2 in southern Ontario for tomorrow evening. But until then, it's all about the cold from coast to coast. And do you miss this guy? Chris St. Clair? I do. We're going to be checking in with Chris coming up next, right after we take a look at your local forecast. Okay, so speaking of icy roads this weekend, because we have strong winds coming off of the water in Newfoundland, watch for some sea-effect snow. Nothing too heavy, but you could run into some low visibility. Southern Ontario for Sunday evening, we could see some snow moving through. Again, under 3 centimeters for the most part. And coming up, we'll talk about snow for tomorrow in BC.
Closed captioning of this program is brought to you in part